All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Kyle Anzalone Show. And we have a lot to talk about today, including some of Trump's first remarks on the conflict in Gaza. We will break down what he said and what that means for the future in Gaza and if Israel is going to resume that war. So, a lot of really important stuff to get into today. I see some of you are already tuning in live. We really appreciate those of you who do that. Please take a minute to share out the show, like the show, help us get out there to a few more listeners. And let's go ahead and play the first clip.
Confident are you, Mr. President, that you can keep the ceasefire in Gaza and conclude the three phases of this deal?
I'm not confident. It's not our war, it's their war, but I'm not confident. But I think they're very weakened on the other side.
Do you support the two-state
Gaza, boy, I looked at a picture of Gaza. Gaza is like a massive demolition site. That place it's really got to be rebuilt in a different way.
Do you plan to help rebuilding Gaza?
I might. You know, Gaza is interesting. It's a phenomenal location. On the sea, best weather. You know, everything's good. It's like some beautiful things could be done with it, but it's very interesting. But some fantastic things could be done with Gaza.
How do you see the future in governance for Gaza?
Well, it depends. I can't imagine you could have, well, you certainly can't have the people that were there. Most of them are dead.
So there is a lot of really important things that Trump says in that minute there. The first, and I think probably the most important, is that Trump says he's not confident that the ceasefire is going to continue. And I think if Trump really wanted this ceasefire to ultimately turn into an agreement that leads to all the Israeli hostages being freed from Gaza, a permanent end to the fighting, and a rebuilding of Gaza, then he would have at least said that he thinks this is going to work. He thinks that he's the guy, the deal maker who could get this done. The fact that he is not optimistic here and is not, being very Trumpian and braggadocious about, of course it's going to last. I negotiated this deal. I'm going to make sure it gets done. Biden couldn't do it. Only I could do it. This is what I would expect, that Trump really thought that this was ultimately going to be what leads to a permanent end to the fighting in Gaza. And so this really suggests, as I talked about in the last episode of the show, and we played a clip of Benjamin Netanyahu saying that they plan to return to the fighting after the first 6 weeks, the first 42 days. There will be 33 Israeli hostages released during that time. 900 or so Palestinians will get out of Israeli detention centers. But after that, the fighting will likely resume. That's what I'm taking from Trump's tweet here. Now, or statement. Excuse me. Now, the next thing he said is interesting. I think in a way it's true and in a way it's not true. He says it's not our war, it's their war. And yeah, this is kind of true in the sense that if this war or if the U.S. completely stops supporting Israel in this war tomorrow, that it wouldn't impact me or you whatsoever. It's not going to jeopardize our security. In fact, if anything, it'll make us more secure because the U.S. isn't going to be participating in a genocide. And so there's not going to be additional anti-American sentiment and blowback building up against the United States by participating, arming, and funding Israel throughout this conflict. And so for him to say it's not our war, it's their war, I do think is an important recognition of the situation at hand, that really this doesn't matter to the United States of America. And that's really, really important for the American president to understand, because from Joe Biden's perspective, the way he looked at the world, and look, you could say, well, Joe Biden had dementia. This is something that he's been repeating since the 1980s, that if Israel didn't exist, the United States would have to create Israel. This is the thinking among many people in Washington, that Israel, without it, the United States would not exist. Now, they can't really explain why that is or how Israel benefits American security, because in reality, they jeopardize their American security because we support them in their brutalization of the Palestinian people and upending of the situation in the Middle East time and time and time again. And so I think, in this way, it really isn't not our conflict too, because of all the support the U.S. gives to Israel. And you do worry a little bit that maybe Trump doesn't understand that the view from the outside, the view from the Arab world, the rest of the world, is really that this is America's war, that the U.S. is fighting it. Now, he goes on to, and he says something in there that really isn't right. He says Hamas is weakened. And look, the Gaza Strip has been absolutely decimated. Entire cities were reduced of nothing but rubble, a few crumbling structures remaining. That's it. And so that is very concerning. At the same time, after the ceasefire was declared, Hamas fighters came out and they were welcomed in the streets of Gaza by many of the people there. They were able to, start restoring order. Gaza was the government of Hamas was the government of Gaza before Israel decimated the Strip. And as soon as Israel declared the ceasefire, Hamas was able to return to those positions. And so it really doesn't seem that Hamas has been weakened as much as the United States and Israel would like to believe. And this was an important admission of our former Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, on his way out the door, when he said that Hamas has probably recruited as many fighters as they have lost. And while Trump mentions there at the end, and I think this is what some people thought Trump was referring to the Palestinians in general, where he says most of them are dead. I think he's talking about the leadership of Hamas. So Yahya Sinwar, Ismail Haniyeh, Mohammed Daif, these people, these figures who were killed by Israel through the fighting. Haniyeh, of course, was killed in Tehran by a sabotage attack, and he was a political figure, but still he was a leadership member of Hamas. But at the same time, we have seen time and time again in the Middle East that when you have these groups that have popular support among the civilian population, that new leaders will emerge, that you cannot win this conflict by, taking out the central figure or the lead figure, because somebody is going to rise up to take their place, because you're just creating more hatred, more anger, more young men who are willing to take up the fight against Israel and against the United States when the Israel engages in these ethnic cleansing and genocide campaigns as they have done in Gaza. So with this statement, I am actually very concerned that Trump is essentially moving forward with this policy that I think is not only going to leave the Gaza Strip in ruins, but much of the Palestinian cities of the West Bank. So now let's move on and play this clip of Trump's UN nominee to be ambassador to the United Nations, Elise Stefanik, talking about her viewpoint of Israel and what the Palestinians versus was Palestine versus what is Israel.
But I did ask you whether you subscribe to the views of Finance Minister Smotrich.
Who? I'm sorry,
Smotrich. This is the Israeli Finance Minister Smotrich and the former National Security Minister Ben-Gvir, who believe that Israel has a biblical right to the entire West Bank. And in that conversation, you told me that, yes, you shared that view. Is that your view today?
Yes.
So I find this clip to be exceptionally crazy. You have here the senator really priming Elise Stefanik to say no. Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir are known as the extremist members of a government that is actively engaged in a genocide. And so if you're saying that, do you agree with their viewpoint, you would expect her to say, I might not agree with them entirely. I have my own views. And then also tying her views completely to religion, completely to the Bible. And she agrees with it. I mean, this is absolutely baffling. If you look at the views and things that Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir have said, particularly Ben-Gvir, who seems to be the more blunt, where Smotrich, I think, is actually very politically tactical and very smart. And Ben-Gvir is somebody who will say something like, we have a prison overcrowding situation with the Palestinians, and so we're going to start executing current detainees to make room for new ones. Just really appalling things like that. Or we're going to make life in the prisons worse. We're going to make it abysmal for the Palestinians. We're going to punish them even more. Calling for the complete ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip. Where Smotrich, on the other hand, has worked his way up to be the Israeli finance minister, where he is now able to control the flow of taxes to the Palestinian Authority and could potentially cripple the Palestinian Authority at any time he chooses by turning off the taxes. This is actually something that he almost did during the Biden administration. It was only after a lot of pressure that he finally, allowed those taxes to begin flowing again, keeping the Palestinian Authority, the the government of the West Bank that kind of controls some of it, but Israel is ultimately the occupying power with the ultimate monopoly on force in the West Bank. So Smotrich has a lot of power. He's approving settlements. He's building new settlements in the West Bank. He himself is a settler. And when it came down to the negotiations around the current ceasefire and peace deal, not peace deal, hostage exchange that is currently in effect in Gaza, Smotrich found himself in a very important position. His religious Zionism party basically held the necessary seats to keep the government together after Itamar Ben-Gvir quit the coalition because Netanyahu was going to agree to the agreement. And it seemed what Smotrich got as a concession out of Netanyahu for remaining in the government was an agreement that as soon as that ceasefire takes place, the destruction of the West Bank will begin. And we are already seeing that. Israel is carrying out a raid in Jenin. This is one of the key cities, Palestinian cities in the northern West Bank. They are destroying the roads around the hospitals. They are killing innocent civilians. The scenes on the ground are absolutely awful. Palestinians shot. Ambulances are on the scene, and the Israelis, the IDF intervenes and forces the Palestinian to bleed out and die unnecessarily. Just horrific things are happening now in the West Banks, airstrikes, drone strikes. And so Smotrich is ultimately getting what he wants here. He wants more Israeli seizure of the West Bank and eventually the annexation of the West Bank. Now, this is also a viewpoint that is supported by Miriam Adelson, who is the wife or the, I guess, widow of the late Sheldon Adelson, the casino magnate that has made a lot of his money in China, who has given Republicans a lot of money over the years. And his wife actually gave Trump $100 million during the campaign. And it was reported that strings attached to that money included annexing the West Bank. Now, look, if somebody gives Trump money with strings attached, I think Trump, more so than maybe any politician America has had in the past few decades, will just ignore them and do what he wants. I think here he actually is probably in agreement and does want to see Israeli seizure of Palestinian territory. One of the things that he talks about in that clip is, and you almost like hear a different Trump when he starts to talk about real estate and building, hotels on the beaches of Gaza and things like this. And this is also a viewpoint that was articulated by his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. So I do think that this is pretty deep thinking in the Trump camp, that the territory of Palestine is something that could be carved up, distributed out, and that would mean Israel getting the West Bank, and then Gaza probably being rebuilt with luxury casinos, and I'm sure a grand Trump hotel somewhere on the beach after the Palestinians are all removed. And so Elise Stefanik's comments here are very concerning. We also have Trump's incoming ambassador to Israel, as we talked about in the last episode of the show, Mike Huckabee, explaining that he also, sees this as Judea and Samaria, and that, we can't allow Gaza to continue to exist. All right, so next up, I want to play this clip from Donald Trump speaking on John Bolton, because I think it gives a lot of really important insights into what we could expect out of the next Trump administration and Trump's current thinking.
Why did you remove John Bolton's security clearance, sir?
Because I think that was enough time. It's we take a job. You take a job, you want to do a job. We're not going to have security on people for the rest of their lives. Why should we? I thought he was a very dumb person, but I used him well, because every time people saw me come into a meeting with John Bolton standing behind me, they thought that he'd attack them because he was a warmonger. He's the one that got us involved, along with Cheney and a couple of others, convinced Bush, which was a terrible decision, to blow up the Middle East. We blew up the Middle East and we left. We got nothing out of it except a lot of death. We killed a lot of people. And John Bolton was, one of those guys, a stupid guy. But no, you can't have that for life. You shouldn't expect it for life.
So Trump says a lot of really good things there, right? John Bolton is an idiot. John Bolton is stupid. He got us involved in wars in the Middle East that did nothing to benefit America. All very true. Great that the president realizes it. However, listen to what he says there and how he thinks the world works and how he thinks he's going to engage in diplomacy. So he said he thought it was a great thing that even though John Bolton was an idiot, that when he walked into a room for diplomat negotiations, the other side would basically get scared and think, oh no, a regime change is coming, so we have to make a deal. But is that actually what happened during the first Trump administration? No, that's exactly the opposite of what happened. So Trump had almost negotiated an end to the Korean War, a process that would see North Korea, their sanctions reduced, them open up to South Korea, maybe over the long term closing their nuclear facilities, at least scaling back their nuclear weapons program. Real achievements in the realm of denuclearization and peace were on the brink of being made in 2019 when Trump and Kim arrived at the Hanoi summit. And unlike Singapore, this time Trump brought John Bolton with him, and Bolton threatened the North Koreans. He said, you remember Libya? And why he invoked Libya was Muammar Gaddafi had not a nuclear weapons program, but had the components to build a nuclear weapons program, and agreed to give those up in exchange for what's called coming in from the cold, but essentially being allowed back into the international liberal world order. And Bolton said that to Kim. And ultimately what happened to Gaddafi is that the U.S. engaged in a regime change against him, and he was killed on the side of the road by a bunch of jihadist thugs. And so when Kim heard this, he would never agree to a deal, because this is basically a threat that if you agree to a deal with us, eventually when it's convenient for us, we will come and we will kill you. We will overthrow and replace your government with one that we want. And so actually John Bolton's presence in negotiations destroyed them, didn't save them. If you look at what happened during the Trump administration, once John Bolton becomes national security advisor, the North Korean talks blow up. Nothing ever gets done with Iran. The intermediate range nuclear forces treaty with Russia, an agreement that prevented land-based nuclear-tipped missiles from being deployed in Europe, was scrapped because of Bolton. The Open Skies Treaty, that was an important arms control monitoring agreement, was scrapped because of John Bolton. And so there was no negotiations, there was no diplomacy because of John Bolton. Things actually got worse because of his involvement. And it doesn't seem that Trump has any understanding of that whatsoever. Now, there is, I think, a little bit of other good news in this clip, and maybe some of Trump's understanding. So this is an article that I wrote for the Libertarian Institute titled "Trump Orders 50 Former Intel Officials Stripped of Security Clearance Over Election Interference." And so I write, in October of 2020, the New York Post reported that Joe Biden's son Hunter had abandoned a laptop at a computer repair shop. Discovered on the device were pictures showing Hunter engaging in criminal and embarrassing actions, as well as emails that suggested high-level corruption involving his father. Following the release of the bombshell story, a group of 51 former intelligence officials issued a letter claiming they assessed the laptop was Russian information aimed at altering the outcome of the upcoming election. Subsequently, the Hunter Biden laptop story was heavily censored on Facebook, Twitter, and other platforms. On Monday, Trump signed an executive order slamming the signatories for weaponing the intelligence community against the American people. And so I think it's unbelievably important that Trump now understands this, that the intelligence community is his enemy, and he stripped 49 former intelligence officials who signed on to the letter. 2 of the signatories are now dead. I think they died of old age, nothing nefarious. And so they no longer had their security clearance. And additionally, John Bolton lost not only his security clearance, but his security detail, which is great news because the American people do not need to be paying for John Bolton to have 24/7 security. Look, if you want to spend your entire life advocating for wars that have so far killed millions of people, and if you got all the ones you wanted, probably would have killed billions at this point, well, freedom of speech, I suppose you could do that, but you cannot do that and then expect the American people are going to have to collectively pay for your defense. That's just absolutely absurd. And so it's good that John Bolton is losing not only his security clearance, because that will take away him. And the names on this list include, former CIA directors, former other top intelligence officials, Mike Morrell, John Brennan, Michael Hayden. So some really important figures here. Leon Panetta, all lost their security clearance through this. And they had used, they get this security clearance and they continue to use it to weaponize the media against Donald Trump by planting stories in the media that, oh, this and that are Russian disinformation, or Trump has these nefarious ties to Vladimir Putin. If you remember to the first Trump administration, after John Brennan left the CIA, he was frequently appearing on CNN suggesting, absurd things like Trump meeting with Vladimir Putin in Helsinki was some kind of act of treason. Imagine that, sitting down with another foreign leader being considered an act of treason, diplomacy being considered treason. But that's what happens when you allow these people to continue to fester. And so hopefully Trump not only understands what they did to him in 2020 around the Hunter Biden laptop story, but around the Russiagate saga as well, and that he will be able to articulate this to the American people. The most important things that have happened in the past decade in America, despite all the wars I cover, I do believe are the 2016 and the 2020 elections and the election interference that happened, not from Russia, not from China, not from Iran, but from our own intelligence community who planted stories in the media to try to take down Donald Trump. And look, this isn't about me thinking that Donald Trump is this great man, this great leader who deserves a presidency, but this is who the people voted for. And the last people who get a say, who get to overthrow the elected president, is the U.S. intelligence community. So hopefully Trump continues to go after this group of people. Now, next up here, I want to talk about this article that appeared in Time magazine and is getting a lot of attention. It's titled, "Why Biden's Ukraine Win Was Zelensky's Loss." And the key quote that people are talking about from this article is, when Russia invaded Ukraine nearly 3 years ago, President Joe Biden set 3 objectives for the U.S. response. Ukraine's victory was never among them. The phrase the White House used to describe the mission at the time was "supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes," was intentionally vague. It also raised questions: as long as it takes to do what? And so some people are saying that this isn't a mission by the mainstream media now that Biden is out of office, that Biden never intended to help Ukraine win the war. And I think this is actually largely rewriting history. When you go through the article, they have a U.S. official saying, "We never pledged to defend Ukrainian integrity and sovereignty, all their territorial integrity, like the Crimean Peninsula. That was never our goal or our objective." But at the same time, you have President Zelensky saying that this is our objective, and the next day the Americans would say that, yeah, the Ukrainians get to, dictate how this war ends. And so they were absolutely saying that the Ukrainians were going to outright drive the Russians from Ukraine or win the war. This is, I think, a real attempt to rewrite history here to make it sound like Biden achieved his objectives, which in this article they claimed Ukraine remains sovereign, a stronger NATO, and no wars with Russia. Now, if you look at that first point, Ukraine remains sovereign. Russia's goal was never to remove Ukraine's sovereignty. Russia, in fact, had negotiated a peace deal in April, just 2 months after the war began, that was ultimately undermined by the US and UK. Boris Johnson actually went to Kiev. I think he was at the time the first foreign leader to go to Ukraine after the war in Ukraine started. And he went to convince Zelensky, you do not want to make a deal. And even if you do want to make a deal, we're not going to let you make a deal. And look, there's a better option. You could fight and we will give you everything you need. So in this, they talk in this Times article, the official talks about the phrase "for as long as it lasts." And that was a phrase that was used time and time again. But the other part of that phrase was, "we will support Ukraine for as long as it takes, and we will give them everything they need. Now, of course, that was always a false promise, and the Ukrainians should have never bought it. But to try to rewrite history now and say that you never made those promises and pledges to Ukraine is just completely false. Now, the second goal they say that Biden had was a stronger NATO. And Biden is going to tout that this is true because the Russian invasion of Ukraine invoked both Finland and Sweden to join the NATO alliance. But those two countries were already de facto members of NATO. They already participated in NATO war games. And actually, after they announced that they were going to join NATO, Putin said, I don't care. He said, if you start deploying nuclear weapons to these countries, then we're going to have to address that. But if they just join NATO, then we don't care. Russia's concern was and always has been Ukraine and Georgia potentially joining NATO, not the Nordic states. And so to pretend that NATO is now stronger just because those two countries are in isn't even true. And if you look at the past 4 years, it really seems that NATO has gotten weaker and more fractures have emerged. If you particularly look at Slovakia and Hungary, these two countries are no longer providing military assistance to Ukraine. And the Slovak Prime Minister, Robert Fico, has actually said that he could wage an energy war against the Ukrainians because he's so upset that the Ukrainians stopped the natural gas transits through Ukraine that ended up in Slovakia. Speaking of which, the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines, and now Ukraine is also targeting the Turk Stream pipeline, has increased the energy prices in Europe, which has weakened, not strengthened NATO and NATO member states. And so the idea that this war has been a great diplomatic success and has strengthened the alliance is also untrue. And Biden said that, one of his ultimate goals was to avoid a war with Russia, but the U.S. is far closer to a direct conflict with Russia now than they would have been had they just negotiated at the beginning of this conflict. Now, I want to play a clip from General Lloyd Austin, who was the U.S. Secretary of Defense, and what he had to say in April of 2022, and this is the United States' real goal.
We want to see Ukraine remain a sovereign country, a democratic country, able to protect its sovereign territory. We want to see Russia weakened to the degree that it can't do the kinds of things that it has done in invading Ukraine. So it has already lost a lot of military capability and a lot of its troops, quite frankly. And we want to see them not have the capability to very quickly reproduce that capability. We want to see the international community more united, especially NATO. And we're seeing that. And that's based upon the hard work of, number one, President Biden, but also our allies and partners who have willingly leaned into this with us as we've imposed sanctions and as we've moved very rapidly to demonstrate that we're going to defend every inch of NATO.
So I think this is very important here, that the real goal was to weaken Russia. And the ultimate thinking here was that even if the Ukrainians have to feed the meat grinder at a far more rapid pace than the Russians are nonetheless feeding the meat grinder. They are worsening their economy. They're somewhat hurting their standing on the world stage by waging an offensive war. And so this doesn't help Russia. Sure, it's cost Ukraine, the two Donbass republics, and also its two southern republics just north of the Crimean Peninsula, hundreds of thousands of young men, billions of dollars, millions of citizens have left and will never return. And, Ukraine is just going to be left as a corrupt rump state, maybe without even access to the Black Sea anymore. But this was all a worthwhile exchange in the thinking in Washington. Because, remember, this Time article is touting Biden's Ukraine policy worked. This, to believe that, you would really have to believe that no matter what happened to the Ukrainians, all that matters is that Russia is in a weaker position now versus how they were in 2020 pre-invasion. And I'm sure that is the case. If you look at, what the Iraq war did to the United States, or even the Afghan war did to the United States of America, spending billions, trillions of dollars on the conflict, sending hundreds of thousands of your young men to go and either kill or be killed, live with lifelong traumas and injuries. Directing your economy in this militarist direction is going to take away funds that would otherwise go towards other things that would benefit society. Russia is more isolated than they were before. Of course, these are all negatives for the Kremlin. At the same time, I think from Putin's perspective and a lot of Russians' perspective, at least they're addressing a core security concern here. So, Austin thinks that this is going to weaken Russia. I think ultimately it's weakening the United States, maybe even a lot more. It's hurting us on the global stage. We've spent hundreds of billions of dollars on this conflict. And ultimately, I think Russia is going to just win this conflict and force the settlement that they want at the negotiating table when Ukraine has no other options. All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning in to the Kyle Lanzalone show today. We really appreciate everybody taking the time to listen, interact in the chat. We had, again, quite a few people watching and listening live. If you're still listening, hit the share button, hit the like button, put it out there to a few more people. Head on over to the YouTube channel and subscribe to the channel. That way, the next time we have another show coming out, you don't miss it. Again, thanks everyone for listening.